Hi there, in this tutorial I'm going to talk in a bit more detail about setting up parameters in ScopeSync. If you're watching my previous tutorial about setting up a new configuration, you'll have noticed that I didn't actually save it at the end of the tutorial, so I'll mention about that quickly. So there's a few places in which you can save. So from the toolbar at the bottom there's a save button. There's also a save button in the configuration manager and a save as, or you can just press Ctrl S in order to save. So that's now saved. So the first thing I'm going to do here is to create a new parameter on the second encoder. Again, that's created me a default parameter, so I'm going to edit that parameter. Within here we've got a number of different settings that describe the parameter. So to start with, we have the mapping name. This is used to map between the encoder or any other control and the parameter itself. So typically you'd leave that as fairly generic to give you the flexibility to change the actual parameter that's mapped to a given control. You've then got the short and the full description. These are used both in the DAW and also within ScopeSync. So here you'll see that param2, which is the short description, is being used here. The full description param2 will also be displayed in the tooltip. So I'm going to just change these now to demonstrate that. I'm just going to pick this as a frequency control for now. So now you can see in here I have frequency and cutoff frequency on the tooltip. Next, if I move on to the ScopeSync code, this is the sort of heart of how the communication works in ScopeSync. So this determines the channel for which the communication happens. So I'm going to pick A2 because this is the second control, but you can lay them out however you want. And this will affect where from the DAW the information gets sent, but also within the scope module which output pad the data is sent from. So in the SS128A, this will be now sent to the A2 output. Now we have the scope properties rather. Each of these describes the range and the settings for how ScopeSync talks to scope itself. So this is a standard unipolar range for the full range of scope. If you wanted to have the minimum, so for bipolar, then you could change that to that value, which I'm not going to read out, but that's the standard bipolar range. So for a frequency, then typically they're unipolar range. The next parameter is a dB reference, so for decibel parameters. When you set up a decibel range, typically it's using a different skew to standard, and it's using a specific algorithm for that. I'll show you how that's set up in a standard dB0, so 0 dB based range. So here the dB reference is set to 1. If I choose dB12, then it's set to 0.25. dB24 is set to 0.0625. So I'm not going to run through the maths now, but I'm sure if you Google it, you'll be able to find out how those dB references relate to the skew curve. I'm just going to switch now to a frequency-based preset so to carry on the example. So I'm going to come back to this skew UI only setting once I've spoken a bit more about skewing for the UI itself. Now, the properties for the UI. The first one of these is the suffix that's displayed. So I'm just going to click out of here so you can see this in effect. So this frequency displays its value in hertz, and that's shown after the number. I could type anything into here I want, but obviously for a cutoff frequency, hertz is quite a good choice. I can now choose the range that I'm going to use. So again, fairly standard range for a frequency would be 20 to 20,000 hertz. And that affects the values that are shown in the user interface. I also have a reset value. Reset value is the value that's loaded by default for a given control, but it's also the value if I double click on it, it'll return to. So in this case, I'm going to set it to 20, so the bottom of the range. Now we have the midpoint value. This is where skewing comes into effect. So if I want to put my midpoint to be halfway through the range, that will mean it doesn't skew at all, but I can set this to be a different value and that will automatically apply a skew to it. So if I set this to 1000 and click out, we'll be able to see how that's been applied. So 1000 is now at the middle of this range. So although it goes from 20,000 down to 20, 1000 is in the middle. So it's a very simple way of setting a skewed control up. Value interval determines how many decimal places, or in fact what the steps are between values. So if I would set that to 1, you'll see that I don't have any decimal places, and each continuous value is 1 greater than the previous. So typically I'm just going to set this to having 2 decimal places, but it depends on the size of the values you're working with. The final setting is more relevant for discrete value items, so I'll come back to that in a second. So with cutoff frequency, it's a continuous control, so we're not going to use that in this case. Now finally, skew UI only. This setting is for when I've got a skewed parameter, so similar to the one I've set up now, but I don't want to apply that when I send the data into scope. That's a fairly unusual use case, but it can crop up, so that's available in there. So if I come back out of here, all of my settings have been applied, and I now have a sensible 20 through to 20,000 Hertz frequency setting. The last thing I'm going to talk about now is discrete values. So if I want to, for instance, control the particular wave for a multimode oscillator, let's pick a preset that uses that already. You'll see that actually quite a lot of the parameters at the top, or the properties, have been removed. That's because they're not so relevant in the case of a discrete value setting. So I have specific items in here that describe my waves and the scope value that's going to change to that. Now if I were to add a new one in there, I can automatically spread the values across the range. Now that might not actually be right for the settings, which is why we've got presets here for the standard BC module ones, but if you're setting up or creating your own modules, or you're using a module that doesn't have a preset, then you can either type them in there, or if they're spread over a range, use the feature I've just made use of. I can also undo by using Control Z to get back to where I was before. So if I look at what effect that's had over here, I can now see I'm moving between specific discrete values within there. So that's a very, very quick overview of setting up a parameter in ScopeSync. In the next tutorial, I'm going to talk a bit about mapping and explain how that fits into the picture.